So I'm really glad that you're here today. Guys, this is Miss Random. Here is her Twitch URL. Um, and I was kind of saying earlier, Miss Random the other day just said something in chat that really got me going. And I can't even quite remember the context. It just seemed like you were kind of trying to, I think, like maybe help someone feel a little bit better about how, like, people's behaviors are just kind of off the wall and it's not making sense, and why aren't things maybe getting better, or things just are different now. And so I guess there's a couple of things I guess we could do. We could jump right kind of into that and go kind of based on like that thought, because that was initially what why I really definitely wanted to have you on. But otherwise, or also, we could just start from the beginning and kind of, talk about you and tell us kind of like the work that you've done, and how you even got to have made maybe a comment like that.
Um, well, I don't
So,
have a
like,
preference.
what do you tell us about you? What is some of like the work that you've done? What has gotten you kind of interested in social psychology and stuff like that?
Well, I started off in the social services sector, working primarily with people as a peer support, in a housing program, that was supposed to be for rapid rehousing. So I was literally going out into the streets, meeting people where they were at, in subway tunnels, gutters, all sorts of things. I have some interesting stories on that, but yeah, just meeting people where they were and realizing like, wow, there's a lot of people who, you know, through no fault of their own, whether it be mental health issues, economic issues, or otherwise societal issues, they're facing homelessness, and a lot of these people are severely traumatized. So housing them, I realized after a while, wasn't enough. These people needed continual, aid and assistance, and so my passion just sort of grew from there. And I've been in the mental health field now for 10 years.
10 years. That's awesome. I feel like I don't even know when to like start my like I don't even know the amount of years at the moment for me, I guess. But that's so cool. And I also do want to point out, guys, that I don't know if you even heard her, or I don't know if you heard her or caught her say this, but she said that she was a peer support. And if you guys remember, that's what I am. I am a peer support. And so when I first initially met Miss Random, I was so stoked to find her, because I don't find a lot of different peer supports, and so that's also really neat, because I feel like peer support is just so uncommon, I guess, right now, and has
Hmm.
been like it dates back forever, but it's just so it's not something people think of as like, I guess, option for support maybe. And so I love that you do that you've done peer support. So what made you want to go back to school? Like what was kind of like the okay, yep, I'm gonna be a non-traditional student, and I'm gonna go back to school and I'm gonna do these things.
Honestly, I will say for me, what really got me focused on going back to school and continuing my education was realizing two things. One is that, just the level of care that people needed, and not seeing them be able to access that in my community for, various biases, whether it be, race, economics, different things. And then also realizing that, I couldn't provide them that support or help them link to that support if I didn't have a degree. There's certain conversations, certain meetings that you're just not privy to, as unfair as that is, if you don't have a degree. So I was like, I have to do this, if not for myself, for my clients.
No, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I'm really glad that you I guess I don't want to say are willing to like take on that challenge to be able to, bridge just like one more gap, especially when it takes the effort of going back to school and going back into academia and trying to hopefully learn accurate stuff that will help you too. Because I know, at least for me, like my degree was absolutely helpful, but I also am noticing a lot of like inconsistencies in ways that I was taught to just kind of approach or handle or think about people or perceive them and stuff. And so I'm excited for you as well because I think it might be neat to I think of things like what is academia like now in the sense that I just feel like people are speaking out a lot more. And so it like, are there going to be battles with kind of professors where someone's like, okay, I know you're teaching this, but do you happen to be privy that like this research was poor and you're teaching us based on it, but like this is actually like not helpful research to be going based off of? I don't know. I just, that was kind of like a my thought kind of took off with that, but I'm just really interested to see, I guess, what happens because I have no idea what it's going to take to help people learn and relearn, I guess, what it means to be a human and have a brain and function because it's really hard to think of things as disorders when we put it in the grand scheme and see that the disordered people are just the ones who can't keep the order to complete the capitalism kind of.
Oh man, I've had some interesting discussions with some professors. I'll say that. Yeah, for sure. I've noticed it especially in psychology, and I hate to say it because I'm a psych major and I absolutely love what I'm researching and doing. But there's a lot of, especially me as a Black and Indigenous woman, that's like my number one. Um, I wouldn't say my number one focus, but I'm very, and I've had to pull professors aside and be like, hey, are you realizing that this might be a racial schema? Are you realizing that this might be, some bias? Is this research sound? Did they check in with multiple people? Is this culturally competent and sensitive? And it's a hard conversation to have, but you know what? I would rather be in the room and have those conversations than to not be privy to them. Because
Which is
like
amazing, and
these
I'm
people are the ones that are creating policy. These people are the ones that are going on to be clinical directors in places. They're creating policy. So if we don't have people like you or me in those rooms and having those important conversations, who's going to speak for those people?
no, absolutely, and I love that, and I'm grateful to know you because I'm I don't know, I think it's really neat that you're doing that even despite all of the things that you could get into in terms of um, just like inequalities and being a marginalized individual. And I know that academia is a struggle for marginalized people. So I don't know. I love that you're doing that. So I know you've brought it up already. You talked about your 2-year burnout. What did that? I'm gonna kind of throw a couple different questions, but feel free to like re-ask or whatever. But like, what did that kind of look like? How did you recognize that it was burnout? Was it like, you were already a year into it and you're like, oh, I'm in burnout right now, kind of thing, or like, what was that like for you? How did it feel like there would be an end? Like, what was that like?
Oh wow. I'm gonna be really candid and say I didn't realize that I had been experiencing a burnout until I started coming out of it. Like I didn't realize it until I started coming out and I'm like, oh wait, these feelings. Oh, I feel pretty good. I feel like, my heart isn't beating all the time. My chest isn't really tight. I'm not having these like, anxiety attacks. Oh, this is what normal TM feels like. I had no idea. I've always been the type of person that's just like really go, go, go. I have to go. I got to get it. I got to work really hard. And especially the field that I've been in for the last 10 years, it's a very high stakes field because if I'm having an off day, those clients don't get their services. And so I took that so serious. And I went really hard even after I left the workforce to go to school full time. I just took that energy and respin it into I'm gonna get through school as fast as I can, just run, 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 and do everything to the maximum capacity, which has been fantastic for my GPA, I will say, but it has not been great for my for my mental health. I'm just being honest. Yeah.
Well, I like that. I'm glad that you we're honest in the sense that you said that you didn't realize until you're coming out of it, because I think that that's a huge part of it, especially if you don't really know about burnout beforehand too. I feel like because like for me, I guess is it a dark period, or could it really be burnout? I think that we don't talk about burnout as something that, I don't want to say as something that can be recovered from, but I feel like we talk about, when we think about, or like when I see people talking about burnout, it's always talking about like, if you get burnt out, like this is a means to an end kind of thing. And so I feel like it's not often talked about in the sense of like experiencing the burnout and like, or rather coming out of burnout and then realizing like that's kind of what you went through. I feel like when we hear burnout, we don't hear things like that, I guess, if that makes sense. And so in terms of being able to like apply it to yourself and kind of realize that that's what's happening to you. Do I make sense with that?
Oh yeah, I mean, like it was really fascinating to me because I had identified burnout in clients, but that self-realization, like, oh, this is my burnout, these are things, and hindsight is 2020, so it's wonderful to look back and sort of see some of the things like, oh, this is a sign when, certain hobbies and stuff that normally I'm super passionate about, I was feeling like kind of sluggish and didn't want to do, or I would have crying fits. Oh gosh, I'm one of those criers in the shower, where you get in the shower and it's all nice and steamy and you're like, wee, just things like that. That I look back on and I was thinking like, oh, I was having a bad day. But when a bad day is a bad week, and a bad week is a bad month, and a bad month is a bad couple of months, and you're like, somebody's asking you, hey, how are you feeling? And you're like, oh, I'm hanging in there. It's like that might be burnout, or at least it was for me.
No, I feel like that's a just, I don't know, maybe it humanizes it a little bit or something. Because I also feel like burnout might be intimidating, and so it might be hard to admit that this is burnout versus, like you're saying, like a bad couple days into a bad couple months into, whatever that ends up being. Now, I guess maybe I have a question. Where or how, or is there a good way to kind of like, I don't know, maybe it's just like the label for the period of time and there's interchangeable labels, but if you think about someone maybe who like has depression. So I guess for me, when I was going through like my period, basically, I think I just always thought it was like a period of depression. Now, I guess there's a couple different pieces of this here too, because with learning about my neurodivergence, I think that burnout much better applies to what I was experiencing. However, I don't want to say what's the difference between like a burnout period and like a period of depression, but also kind of like I guess I am kind of asking like what is the difference, or how do you, is my question making sense?
Yeah, like how do you perceive the difference between burnout and depression? Um, Gosh, I'll start by saying I am not currently a clinician yet. But in the DSM-5, there's several criteria that fit for depression. And I would say if you're a person who is susceptible to depression, has people in your family that has depression, or you've been diagnosed with like maybe recurrent depression, or depressive episode, you're more likely to be having a depressive episode and not necessarily burnout. But I think the key thing is that with self-care and self-kindness, and I know that's such a buzzword, right? Like everybody's saying self-care, but I think self-care kind of describes actions or behaviors that we can do to take care of ourselves. And it looks different for different people. But if you're experiencing burnout or a depressive episode and you're giving yourself that self-care and taking time to yourself, and it's still not getting better, I guess that's when I would talk to a clinician and see if that is more along the lines of depression.
Thanks for sharing that. That's helpful. Um, I don't know if you got the chance to like look at the questions that I put, but I kind of included this in this same like section. So I know when we discussed talking about what burnout was like for you, you mentioned that you might have to look back through your like your past journals. So
Hmm.
let's talk maybe a little bit about like journaling and stuff. So maybe you can kind of start where you want, but like, what has your journaling journey been like? When did you realize that like all of a sudden now you kind of have what would it be called? I don't know the right word, but like you already have like now kind of just like past history journals to go through when you need to maybe check something. Like how did you get to the point where you were like, I'm making my I can't think of the word I'm looking for, but like a way to go back and look, especially to not remember things differently. But like how did you come to realize that like it would be legitimately helpful for you to like just I guess journal all the things. What did you journal? What kind like how did that help? Just all the things.
Well, I started journaling after one of my therapists recommended to me. Shout out to Sarah. Thank you so much. Um, because I was working with her on some past trauma and I was really having a hard time um, remembering certain feelings, like in my body and thoughts that I was having in my mind. And she's like, hey, this is something that is associated usually with trauma. You have a hard time just sort of remembering how you felt because your mind is just so focused on survival. You're not thinking about, how you feel. She really encouraged me to, just kind of sit with myself for 30 minutes a day and really think about how I felt, even if it was like in reflection, like at the end of the day or at the start of the day. And so I started doing that where I would write at the beginning of the day at least one thing that I was going to do to be kind to myself. And then at the end of the day, just reflecting on my thoughts. And it just sort of took off from there. But I strongly recommend it to anyone who has experienced, you know, childhood traumas or any trauma really, because it just really is it's like a gauge. You can see over a long period of time how your moods are changing, your feelings are changing, and that way you can keep a better eye on yourself. One of the things with burnout, I went back in my journal and I looked, and I had a 1.5 year period there where it was just either meh or below, and that's a good indicator.
No, I like that. I like that. And then also I wonder maybe we can kind of like pair this up a little bit with the journaling also might lend a little bit to understanding or helping us realize that maybe we're not at our baseline that we were at.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's like, oh, well, I'm not really getting back down to where this was in like my past. So what's going on? I feel like that could be helpful as well. So maybe let's talk about that a little bit. What does it mean to be at baseline? And yeah, what does it mean to like kind of be at like your emotional baseline? And then um, what what do you mean when you say that because of like this pandemic and the pandemic fatigue that we're not really getting back to our regular baseline, so we've kind of formed this new kind of baseline.
Yeah. Um, I was actually having this conversation with a friend of mine, and I know different people are calling it different things. Like some people are calling it fatigue, some people are calling it pandemic fatigue, pandemic burnout, different things. I call it baseline. And what I mean by that is, if there's nothing happening, just how we feel in the usual, like our typical day to day when really stressful or sad things aren't happening, how we feel. And I was actually talking about this with a psychology professor of mine, and we were both mentioning, like long. Oh gosh, how do I share this? There was an event that had happened, and normally that event, it was something so trivial, was particularly upsetting to me, and it was usually something that really would not matter. But it's because we're not coming back down to that baseline, because every day is a traumatic day, right? With the pandemic, with the housing crisis, with people not being able to afford groceries, people not returning back to work, the racial tension that we're having in our nation, with all of the riots and the marching and the fighting and the Proud Boys and just all of the stuff that's happening. It's like, how can you be well with an illness? Like you're a lot of people, I think, don't realize how strong our nervous system is. Our nervous system is what keeps us alive. It's what keeps us safe. It's what keeps us going. And if my nervous system is like, hey, you are in danger every single day, it's going to stay at that rate. It's never going to come back down. And you just have this like extreme stress and fatigue. And it really makes people of, I would say, like, I not lose consciousness, but make them, it kind of makes you less mindful, because you're so focused on survival. You don't have time to think about, oh, if I say this to so and so, how are they going to feel about that? Or, oh, if I do this action, how will it affect the next 10 people? Because everything is in the short term. Really thinking long term and thinking about others can, be harder to do for a lot of people.
Yeah, no, I really agree with that. With how you were saying, like, we're so focused on survival, yeah, like we're significantly less mindful, I feel like, because and I feel like that just kind of like sends me into a rabbit hole sometimes of, well, if we had our Maslow's hierarchy of needs met, we would feel better. Um, but to that ADHD thought took me away. Um, to just, I think the sheer exhaustion makes it hard to be mindful, because at that rate, like, your brain is literally not almost willing to compromise because it's trying to protect you. It is acting appropriately. It is working correctly. That's, I think, the biggest thing that is hard for people to maybe accept, is that most of the time our bodies are working the way they're supposed to. And it's more like kind of the environment and sometimes our ability to get out of it, because sometimes it's like, yeah, we can, try to make the changes. And sometimes we literally actually kind of can't. Like, we can make as much change as we can. And then, man, I was talking about this with, no, I wasn't talking about it. I watched, are you familiar with the Twitch Take This?
Mm-hmm.
So they had a conversation earlier this week. I think it was on Monday. And one of the things I feel like I remember them talking about was related to how, even if we kind of do the self care and the things that we need to do to heal, that if there's no accountability for the things around you besides yourself, it becomes harder to be able to heal, because you can do everything that you can do, but when the outside isn't changing, you're seriously stuck. Like, you're just stuck. And I don't remember where I was going with that, but that was just really interesting, because like that makes sense to me. That uh, my brain went off. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Okay. I think I agree with that. And I think that people should be kinder to themselves in these times. And everybody's saying these times, but it really is these times. This is going to be a flashbulb memory for the majority of us adults. This is something that we're not going to forget. I don't think 40 years from now, when I'm sitting in my rocking chair thinking of the old times, I'm going to forget about COVID. I'm not going to forget about the pandemic and how it affected me and everyone I love and everyone around the world. And just taking that extra second to have empathy for the other people around you and realizing that, some of their behaviors and actions really just are stressed and sad people reacting in stressed and sad ways.
No, I definitely agree with you. And real quick, I don't know if you have the stream pulled up and muted or not, but we
Oh,
just got no worries, of course, but we just got a raid. So I just want to quickly welcome in the raiders here. Good morning, friends. Happy Thursday. I'm so glad you guys are all here today. We are currently interviewing Miss Random from Twitch, and we are just talking about all the things like social psychology and baseline, kind of like having baseline and burnout during the pandemic, and like kind of why people maybe are like, how to maybe process the way that people are acting if they're acting differently than you're used to, and you're like, why are they being like this? And just different things like that. So thank you guys, Raiders, for being here, and everyone else. So I yeah, I very much agree. And so, maybe to kind of go back with like the prefrontal cortex development and the things like why haven't they learned that yet? So, the being in the pandemic is definitely now going to, or has been, revealing some of the things that different people haven't really necessarily like processed through. And so now sometimes I think it's almost as if like behaviors that we actually didn't even know were going to potentially even come up are coming up because we didn't get to that level of like possible processing and continued growth with like our prefrontal cortex. And so I guess maybe to start, do you want to like explain what the prefrontal cortex is and how that affects our ability to like keep ourselves together?
yeah. So the prefrontal cortex is right up here. Bing, bing, bing. And it is the powerhouse of your brain. It literally helps people. It's like the CEO of your brain. It gives those commands for behaviors. It gives those commands for memories. It gives those commands for, and especially impulse control. It isn't the main part of your brain that's responsible for like some of the more important things like breathing, like the basic functions, but it is basically the CEO. So when you're thinking about actions or behaviors that you're doing, your prefrontal cortex is the one that's like, hey, maybe not touching that hot stove, might not be a good idea. It just kind of helps with that impulsivity. And it's something that grows over time. So it's not, or rather, I should say, myelinates over time, which helps it to function better over time. And for a lot of people, that doesn't finish happening till, I mean, I know like different scientists speculate different things like 25, 27, somewhere in there. And I know that there's research being done at several major universities that is working on seeing how trauma impacts prefrontal cortex development. When we're thinking back to that comment of why don't certain X person know X thing yet, it may just be an issue with that, where, maybe this person has experienced trauma somewhere in their life, and, it's taking them a little bit of extra time to figure something out, or maybe that's not an experience that they personally have had. I know when I would have conversation with clients and they would get, really upset, or, have a lot of emotions surrounding why another person's action doesn't match what they want it to be. I would just talk about how, um, really at the end of the day, we're only responsible for how we think and feel. And because of that, and because different people have different walks of life, different experiences, that is shaping and growing that prefrontal cortex, it's really, it's not up to us. We're just all here for the ride, and all we can do really is just support and nurture each other.
Thanks for explaining that. And if you guys didn't catch that part, One of the things we were talking about before we scheduled the interview and stuff was kind of just like, why hasn't that person learned that yet? Like, this person's 28. Why are they acting like this? Or not even 28. This person is 32. Why are they acting like it? Or, oh, adult, like, you find adult children or blah, blah, blah. And I think it's interesting how we maybe like get frustrated or get mad or just, why don't they know it yet? Instead of, I guess, just kind of supporting people where they're at. Um, we assume that because people are an adult or of this age, that they have gone through what they needed to go through and had like the processing time that they need to be like, okay, well now I'm here as an adult. And it's like, and I think another thing is like, why do they act like that? But then also, like, you have maybe the two different groups where it's like, well, this kid, we know that they were adopted and this and that and all the other things. And they have, like, the obvious list that can, like, better kind of excuse the behaviors. But when it's, like, a less obvious or less known kind of thing, it's just like, why is this person just, like, not functioning like they should be functioning kind of thing? And I agree. And it's interesting just how we have such expectations for our brains, I think, and we don't do as much of the brain care as I think that we should. But I also don't really, I don't really know why, other than to be like, well, taking time to think about feelings will make you be more slow and not as productive. But um, just it's just really interesting to think about how we're just really judgy.
Yeah. And I mean that's human behavior. I mean
We're just trying to make
that's
sense of what we're perceiving.
literally that's what it is. And our brains are hardwired to do that. In an instant when you meet somebody, bam, in 3 seconds you already have some judgments or reservations about them, whether that be conscious or subconscious. And it just is the way it is. But I think that, again, that prefrontal cortex is the part that's supposed to, once we have that judgment, once we've made those reservations about people, that, taking that time to train it, of course, with, mindful thinking, mindfulness, self-care, et cetera, is going to be able to help you to take that extra 3 seconds, think about why you made those reservations about people, why you have those judgments about people, and do something about that. Because we're all going to make judgments about people when we meet them. I make judgments about people. Nobody's perfect. I meet somebody on the street. I'm like, oh, why do they do that? And then oh, why are they living like that? Oh, why do they dress like that? Also, it's natural. But just taking those extra 3 seconds to be like, okay, I just had this thought about why. Let me reframe it as, what barriers is this person facing for them to have those behaviors or actions? What barriers is this person, has this person experienced in their lifetime that has drawn them to this conclusion?
Yep.
Because it's typically what it is.
It's
Yeah.
not why are they like this, it's what happened.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Absolutely.
which is huge. Now, on the note of perception and how we perceive things, maybe we can switch over a little bit to therapy. And because I feel like also, if we are humans and those judgments and those perceptions and stuff are made, that means that our providers need to be extra intentional about being mindful about how they're perceiving things and making sure that they're not perceiving something that is like completely different than like the client might be trying to explain or express. And so, one of the things that you shared with me about like what you kind of do in your work with like therapy and open notes and transparencies, you just said that you are really big on transparency and you do what's called like open notes with your clients. And so, can you tell us a little bit about like what that means? So, like maybe what notes am I referring to? And then also, what happens with those notes? Like, what do these notes mean for providers, and why does it matter that like providers do still check in with you? Because it doesn't matter, like they can perceive all the things they want, but like ultimately they're not experiencing it.
Hmm.
So they literally can't like make a different judgment if they're not fully understanding what like the client is trying to express. And then you can run into issues where you might even be feeling like, people think things are worse for you, and you're like, no, like I feel fine. I'm just trying to like express these things or something. So I went a little bit uh, uh, further there, but therapy and transparency and open notes with clients and stuff.
Yeah, so I think that open notes in general and transparency in general, in whenever you're talking about any sort of mental health services, is so important, because it puts the power back in the hands of the client. And I feel like because mental health is so stigmatized and there's so many reservations that people have about therapy already. I've heard from, numerous clients, friends, people out on the streets, like, I don't want to go see a therapist, because I don't know what they're saying about me, or I feel uncomfortable because in the past, a therapist has, written notes that aren't exactly accurate or not how I feel, I was presenting myself. So just whenever I would first meet with a client, the first thing that I would discuss is my transparency policy, which would be, depending I'm working for, of course, just letting people know, like, hey, this is what, throughout the session, checking in with people, like, hey, this is an observation that I'm making about your behavior. I'm noticing that, when you do this, you report back to me that you feel this way. Is this accurate? Just kind of checking in, asking those questions, and putting that control back in the hands of the client so they can narrate their own stories. Because at the end of the day, I go home. This is not my story. This is your story. And as far as notes, I think anyone seeking mental health services should know that when you go and you see a clinician, there are notes that are being made, whether they're being made actively while you're in your meeting or otherwise. Um, these notes are being made and they're in your health records, your mental health records. They're clinical notes typically. And it can be anything from just, observations of behavior to the way you're dressed, the way that you're talking, your cadence of your voice, just little observations to it's all, but for clinician, just to write about, how you're doing and what services might you need and what referrals you might need. And at the end of every session, I would always show my notes to my clients, or like a brief summary of my notes, like, hey, here are some things that I'm going to talk about in your notes today. Here are some observations that I made. Here are some referrals we can think about in the future. And here's your homework for you to do at home. Do all these things look good? And, yes, no. And that's when I put it in.
Thanks for sharing that. I think that that is really something that should be, utilized a lot more in other spaces. Real quick, oh yeah, Mr. Krabs, she's actually going to school for social. You can just Miss Random. What are you going to school for? Just so I don't say it
Oh, you're
incorrectly.
okay. I am majoring in psychology and minoring in sociology. And I've worked in the mental health field for 10 years, partially as a peer support specialist and then as a qualified mental health associate.
Thank you, thank you. So as far as like the transparency, I actually came up with kind of some questions that I thought would potentially be helpful to try to talk through. Um, if someone's sitting here thinking like, wow, open notes, I want my clinician to do this. So I guess some of my thoughts were like, is this something that like a client can ask from their provider, in the sense that like if you if the agency that you're at, maybe like, are there places that like explicitly say like, no, you can't see the notes? Or is that something that like a provider might start to feel kind of uncomfortable with, to be like, why do you want to see my notes? Like if they have never like heard of or thought of reason for their clients to see the notes. Or I guess just like, well, I guess you can answer that one first, and then I'll go on. But like, is that someone hears this and they're like, I would like this to kind of be going on with my providers. What I guess could be some ways or options to attempt to bring that up with a provider, and or what can you like look for to try to find a provider who does do these things?
Yeah, so I know that there is a national movement that is working on and advocating for open note policies at different, offices and things. It's gosh, I hope I don't forget it. Opennotes.org. I went to a conference recently and heard about it, which I thought is fantastic. And it's sort of, I would say it really depends state to state. I know that Oregon is a little bit, when that's where I live and where I've been practicing. Oregon is a little bit more client first care. So, people's rights and things like that are more respected here. I know in some, maybe some more conservative states that might be a problem, but I think that if I were currently on the market for a therapist and I wanted to find somebody that was going to be transparent with me and would allow me to see my notes, that would be something that I would discuss literally at the first meeting. I would say, hey, and of course, try to approach it as best we can, right? With kindness, just being like, hey, I really like being in charge of my, or being on top of, my health, all of my health, which includes mental health. I would really appreciate it if um, be a part of seeing, receiving my clinical notes, understanding what's in there, and just clarifying what's in there. What is your current policy on note transparency?
Thanks, I appreciate that. I feel like because like for me, that's something that I don't think that I have with my provider. And so even if someone was like, "Oh, I could ask this," it's like, well, I don't even know how to approach it. Like, what if they think that I'm trying to manipulate or something? I don't know. Like, I think when I think I'm just trying to like think like, what would a provider even think if, or do you know like what often like if a provider is like, oh, this client asks to like see their notes and stuff, what is a, I don't want to say like what is a common reaction, but like what kind, yeah, I guess like what kind of reaction do they like get like skeptical or like suspicious or and I know that that's not like it's obviously like a general statement, but maybe I'm asking in the sense of like how to prepare so if you do bring it up and your provider kind of like goes off the wall potentially and to maybe like keep you from maybe feeling like you're in a worse spot because they might they I don't I don't want them to interpret that even worse.
Honestly, I think that this whole movement for open notes is gaining more traction. I think that especially since now more clinicians are moving towards more client-based care and being more open and respectful to their clients and wanting them to be able to advocate for themselves. I think that most clinicians that I'm to or am aware of are usually pretty okay with that. I would say, and this is just my opinion, I'm not a clinician yet, but if a clinician is just not willing to be transparent with you, perhaps it's time to look for a new clinician. And I know that, saying that has a lot of privilege in there because there's some people that that's just not an option, but just being aware that you have a right to that. Just like you get a printout every time you go into the doctor's office, every time you go into the ER, they give you a little printout that is a summary of your appointment. You have that same right to have a summary of your appointment for your therapy session. You should know what you're paying for or what your insurance is paying for, and you should know what's in those notes. It's your right.
I really like how you thanks for bringing that back up because that's a very very fantastic example. Like we absolutely do get a print off from what took place at the doctor's appointment. what's wrong, what kind of care, this, that, and the other thing. And we don't get that from therapy. Like, the most you might get would be homework, but sometimes even then, it's not like integrated into like what you're working on, I feel like. Um, my brain thought left. Uh, like so if even if they give you homework, like I don't know, like the printout thing from the doctor just like makes sense because if they're giving you homework, it could be neat to like the homework could have some like in a category and you could like know which category you're in or something. I don't know. I just
Oh,
that's
absolutely. And when I would do those notes, that's what I would do. I would type the homework right at the bottom. And it's a great way, again, they can, clip that up. And in fact, that's what I do with my notes. I do have open notes with my therapist, just being transparent. And at the end of my sessions, I just take a little screenshot and I add that to my digital journal. I put that in with it. So that way I can remember, oh, hey, at this session, we talked about this.
wow.
What am I supposed to be working on? What is going on? Just like you want to check in with anything else health wise.
What
You
clinician
know,
wouldn't want to be like that? Because think like if they did that and then they give the people the opportunity to put that in there, like if they sent us home with freaking receipts of what we did that day, and like I feel like that in itself would get someone to potentially try to journal without even trying to journal because it's kind of started for them.
yeah, no, really. And I another thing I like to think about with the open notes thing is that, um, you know, especially when you're working with like some deep seated traumas, you know, I'm just gonna be honest. When I'm done with my therapy session, this is what she's doing. Actually crying. I can't recall what I just talked about 5 minutes ago. I'm in survival mode, like I can't, think about this. It's really hard. It's really difficult to recall what specific things we talked about or what sort of advice she gave me. And so being able to refer back to that note and really sit and marinate on some of those quotes. She's really good at writing quotes for me. Like if she gave me a specific quote of the day, like I remember one time she told me I was being really hard on myself. And I think it was because I got my first non-A for a class and I was like, oh my God, I'm just gonna die. I got a B plus. Oh, it's so terrible. And she said to me, she's like, that same thing, you're really good at talking other people down from the edge and that, bringing people to the table of kindness and pouring them a cup, right? And she says, why don't you try pouring a cup for yourself today? And so she wrote that quote in my notes, and I often look at that. It does. I think it's an amazing tool on multiple levels and for multiple reasons, especially the accountability. I absolutely agree. And it works both ways because if my therapist isn't holding up her end of the bargain, I'm going to be more aware. And if I'm not holding up my end of the bargain, if I'm not putting in that work and doing the homework that she's assigning me, there's a receipt right there. So if I show up and she's like, hey, Miss Random, did you do this assignment that I gave you? I'm like, oh, you mean the one that's in my notes? We both know. And it holds me just as accountable because I feel like a lot of people, and this is just my opinion, I feel like a lot of people go to therapy and they talk, and that's wonderful. But for me personally, I want to go to therapy and I want to work. I want to work on becoming a better person. I want to work on my traumas. I want to work on understanding myself more, understanding the world more. And I'm not paying just to have a conversation. I'm paying to get better.
Well, I
So
accidentally was muted with the last thing I said, so I'm just gonna catch them up quick. Guys, I was just saying that, like, in the chat, you guys are really, agreeing and saying like, yeah, why isn't this summary kind of a thing? Like, we should do this. This sounds really great. And then also what I said was, for me personally, like just having this conversation kind of about the transparency is making me really excited to for like my next session with my therapist, because I feel a little bit more empowered now, like in an excited way to be able to take, you know, a stand and control of like what I want my treatment to be like. And I think that this conversation specifically is helping with that, which is just mind blowing to think that we can just have conversations like this because we're just people and we're people and we know different things and we can share different things. And since you know these things, you can share with us and we can learn from it and make our own discoveries. And we didn't even have to like go through a class for it or something. Like we can just keep growing and learning. And I'm just really freaking grateful. And honestly, I'm empowered. I feel like the more I meet people that are similar to me and see how we go through things similarly, or just like all of the things, it feels like every time I see something relatable, it's like another piece of weight is off of my chest, because it's like I'm not the only one. And so this means that surely we're working towards like changing things a little bit, or at least we're aware of it more than me thinking I'm crazy. Like yesterday at the chiropractor, he was like, "How does your neck feel?" beforehand, and I was like, I mean, I'll be honest with you and say that I don't actually know a number because I think I've been ignoring it for too long. I don't actually know an accurate pain level for my neck because I've been trying not to think about it. And so, why did I link that to it? Why did I link that thought to the conversation? Darn ADHD. My apology. Um, oh, are you muted now?
Oh, nope.
Oh,
Can you
no,
hear me?
no, no. Okay, sorry. Um, I don't even remember that was a definite ADHD thought. Sorry. But no, I'm glad that people in the chat are saying that they're gonna look into the open notes thing with their therapists. Well, and some are still finding therapists. We do have a question here. Do you think, on the topic of open notes, that there could be some forms of care or some points of work where a person may benefit from a more closed or private note policy dynamic by chance?
Great question. I think that it really depends. It's a case by case thing, but I'm sure there are. Like for example, a couple of things that come up to mind might be if certain notes are triggering to people, like one thing that comes to mind is I did have a client where we kind of did talk about the open note policy that I had, and that they were available to her, but because of certain issues that she had with her eating disorder, certain things that I wrote about that would be re-traumatizing and triggering, and so those parts of the notes I wouldn't share with her. So observations about her weight and things like that, I wouldn't share. But I still let her know that that was a part of her note, but not necessarily giving her a copy of that or letting her read it, if that makes sense.
And I think that that makes sense, and I would agree, I guess, on the case by case, because part of me just feels like already like someone having the ability to say like, no, I don't want to see the notes, is still them getting a choice versus
Mm-hmm.
not getting to say that they do or don't want to see it. Um, and I also think that that's, yeah, that makes sense, and that's a good idea because, right, you don't want to like re-traumatize them and stuff, and sometimes it might just be as simply as, kind of like you were saying, even just writing down maybe some of the things we were talking about, but trying to like leave out the more triggering things. That is still extremely relevant for a journal. And so, did that answer your question, Jimmy? That was a really good question. One of the things it makes me think
Also,
of would be like, and this might be different, and you might have opinions. I don't know how much you've worked with people under 18, but I also think of things like a parent who, I'm not so much saying that I want the parent to see the notes, but how maybe could that work? Or like what happens if there's a parent who's like, I don't want you showing the kid the notes, or like they want to see the note but they don't want, they're like, oh, I'll take advantage of the open note, but I don't want the kid to see them or anything. Do you have any, I guess, like thoughts or experience in that regard?
I have limited work with youth for that very reason, because it's such a delicate balancing act of, working with them and working with the parents. But um, I would say if I ran into that issue, or if somebody was experiencing that, and again, open notes it's a multi thing. There's some people who want access to their full clinical notes. There's some people who just want a brief summary typed up of what I observed and what's happening. There's some people that want a mixture where, once a month they want their full clinical notes for the month, or you know what I mean, or just a summary or something. It really depends. But I think that if I was working with a minor who had an interest in seeing their notes, but their parents didn't want them to see them, I would speak with the parents first, because, obviously you have to work through the parent. It's their right, about how having at least a summary of what the meetings that I had with their child would be beneficial to the child, how that's going to help them have more accountability, being able to work on their homework a little better, being able to understand why I'm asking certain questions, or why I'm perceiving certain things, and being able to check my perception versus their perception, so we can get more in the middle of an understanding, because what I perceive is may not be what's happening. I can perceive a lot of things about you. That doesn't mean that that's what you're actually experiencing. And so to be able to have the most accurate sessions with your child, I would like to be able to share that or express that in some way. Is there some way we can come to a compromise, or is there some level of notes that I can share or let your child be a part of that would help with their recovery?
Yeah, I like that. And then we do have someone here in the chat, Trust Myself, which hello and welcome in. They said that depends on the current mental capacity of the client. If the client is able to make informed consent in their best interest, we cannot show the parents their notes or update them unless they are listed as a client or a stakeholder.
I think that varies on state to state. I know there's some states that it's like absolutely not. If a child is being seen, a minor is being seen, that parent gets to see everything. And then in some states, minors have more rights. So I
That's a good point.
it
That's a
really
really, really
varies.
good point.
Yeah.
Because I remember working with kids and I'm like, but they can't tell your parents what's going on in therapy. But that's hard. I did have like a quick thought. I think it kind of stemmed from referring to or like thinking about the current mental capacity of the client. Let's go back to like over 18. Current mental capacity of the client. What happens if the client, okay, I know that you and others in the chat and like, clinical advice and stuff, so I'm just going to put it out there and like however you guys feel like you can, respond or answer, do that. But I recognize that it's difficult to answer certain questions. What if a client feels like they are not in crisis and their provider does feel like they are in crisis? Maybe, for example, in one instant. So, I have a couple of different stories, but I do have like one thought specifically actually that might be worth bringing up here in general, and it might not be the place, but we'll figure it out. Anyway, so I was on Twitter a couple of weeks ago, and I found this random thing. There was a streamer who their treatment team like came into his house while he was streaming and was like trying to talk to him, and he got kind of like agitated as they were trying to like talk to him unexpectedly and these different things. And they were like asking him why he's like upset and angry, and they were concerned about his mental health, and he like there's a recording of it even, and he kind of got increasingly agitated because he's like, I don't know why you guys are here, like I've been checking in with you, why do you keep saying you're super concerned about my mental health, like my parents aren't even, like my dad doesn't understand why you keep contacting me. Like, yes, I'm angry. You just showed up in my house. And like, kind of ultimately, like, towards the end of the recording, what ended up happening was like the clinician, she was like, well, it sounds like you're pretty worked up. So we're going to take you in. And they took him in and they hospitalized him.
Oof. Wow. I haven't seen those clips, so that's sort of disturbing.
What is it? Like, current mental capacity of a client? Like, when are you being told that your reality might actually be different versus you might actually be unsafe? Because like I brought this up to one clinician and they were like, well, if you don't take them and something happens, then who do you blame? And I'm like, what about all of the trauma that comes when you take them and you might be wrong?
I think that that's a tightrope that you have to walk as a clinician, or as any level of clinician, in the mental health field. That's a hard question. I would say it kind of goes back to that transparency thing
Especially if
I
they're an
talked about
adult.
earlier. Yeah, especially if they're an adult. So we're not talking about children here. We're talking about adults. Um, depending on what agency you're working for or yourself or whoever, having that policy in place where you have a conversation with, and it again, it depends on, what the level of your client's needs are, and where they're at. But just sharing like, hey, I'm noticing. Oh, well, let me see. I guess I'll share an experience that I had. And I'm trying to make sure that I remove certain pieces so that it's not sharing too much. But I had a client who, you know, uh, had a history of doing things that, included self harm. And I was very transparent with her when I would notice certain behaviors ramping up, that could lead to that same level of self harm. And I would say, hey, here's what I'm seeing. I'm noticing this behavior. You're talking about you this a little bit more. I'm noticing ideations with this type of behavior a little bit more. It's very dangerous. You know, if escalates in any way, this is going to have to get to a point where your level of care that you need is not something that I would be able to provide here, and here are a list of places that would be able to provide that level of care. Are there any in particular you have an interest in or you would feel more comfortable at? And then sadly that client did have to escalate care, and ended up going to a behavioral health unit for, I believe it was about a year. But she's doing better now. So, I mean, and people's needs change, but I just think being really open with people, and letting them know the behaviors that you're seeing, because at the end of the day, if you are a licensed clinician, you are a mandated reporter. And there's certain things that have to deal with and escalate. And trigger warning: suicidal ideations, extreme self-harm, mutilations, child abuse, elder abuse, developmentally disabled adult abuse, things like that are things that absolutely have to be escalated and reported. um, and I would say, case by case, client by client. With some I was able to let them know that, and with others, and privacy reasons for other people that were in danger, I wasn't able to. But even in that, just, you know, it's really tough. I would say for that particular person, I would be curious, um, why they had that level of care, because to have a full team means
That's
that
kind of what I was like, how did they
something
even
has
get in? Because
happened.
I think it was the ACT program, and I was like, how did they even get into the ACT program? Like something happened to kind of cause them being part of it. But for the instance in the video that I watched, and like whether I take in all of the history or not, it was really scary to me because and I hope that this isn't like a poor comparison, But when we think of things like, oh, they shouldn't have shot yet, like they shouldn't pull the trigger yet because it isn't like that exact instance. And so like if the client like isn't visibly upset other than how you're aggravating them, or isn't visibly like doing anything to harm themselves or anything, and it's just like feelings that are expressed, I guess that just, it's confusing to me, because why does the history like matter in that instance? Because at that point, like what they're going to be perceiving is literally going to be like they're being told that their reality is wrong.
It, it's really tough. It's a tough call. I think that history does matter in the context of typically a behavior that you haven't, done in your past is something that you're more likely to do in your future. And especially when it comes to things that are on the more dangerous side, like again, trigger warnings, suicide attempts, you know, bodily harm or harm to another person. If you have a history of doing so, you're more likely to do it again. And as a clinician, it's a really you're really on a tightrope, right? Because you're trying to make sure that you respect um, your client's rights and wishes, but at the same time, you're trying to make sure that you keep them safe. And sometimes those two things, collide, because sometimes, what the client wants is to really harm themselves. And obviously, that's not good for their health. And so, um, I would just say in that instance, it's really hard for me to say what was going on with that individual, but I would be really curious. One, why are they on the ACT program? And two, what behaviors was that person exhibiting before the cameras were rolling that made this team come into action? Because, it's hard to speculate. He could have, or they could have, you know, um, said, today's the day I'm gonna, kill myself. And that would make an ACT team have to go into work, who knows? But it is really unfortunate that that happened to that individual. Yeah, I'm really curious why like a phone call or and wasn't available to come and physically take that person.
Now I will say though that I just like, as you're saying that, I'm just sitting here thinking, well, I feel like the ultimate thing to help that tightrope would be to have open notes, because I feel like that will give you guys
People,
as providers a better opportunity to make sure that you're keeping their, what they want in mind with that, as well as what you're still observing and think should happen.
I think for most people, it's a wonderful idea. I think that for a small minority, it might be something that you'll have to think about different ways to kind of like share some things, but not everything. And for some people, um, it might not be a good option for them at all, depending on, what sorts of traumas they're dealing with or, what their mental capacity is. Because,
Yeah, that's,
you might be working with clients where none of that is understandable, none of
yeah.
that is something that they can be aware of or perceive themselves. So, it really depends.
I really do, though, appreciate, the chance to still have you on here and talk about this and stuff, because even, I think we have like a wide variety of people with different experiences in here and stuff. And I know that like the open note for some of us who are more in a recovery than like an active, bad spot, I guess, the open notes and learning about the transparency was super helpful, even I guess despite some of the nuance that comes behind that. So I do still really appreciate getting to like talk about that and stuff. Does anyone in the chat have any other questions? And then also, Miss Random, is there anything else that you can think of that we either didn't cover or that you want to share?
Um,
It's okay if not, because I always get awkward at that question. I'm like, what? I don't know.
um, uh, just going back on that whole baseline conversation that we had, just really taking that time. I know I've said it so many times this conversation, but and it's something that I'm actively working on myself with my therapist. Shouts out, um, but just making sure that we're just being as nice as we can to ourselves, because um there's just a lot of things going on in this world right now. And even if you are in a privileged position, people are experiencing different levels of trauma right now. And um understanding what that means, that there's going to be certain things that you're going to have a more difficult time with. And it's not because you're stupid or crazy or slow or anything like that. It's literally just you and your body and your mind trying to keep you in survival mode, trying to keep you alive, trying to make sure that you get through this okay. And it's not your fault.
Thanks for sharing that. I appreciate that, and I think that that's definitely valid. You can go ahead, Sam, real quick. But hold on. I need a drink. You hydrate too if you need. Also, I really like your background. It's just so nice and pink and light and pink and pixely and rainbowy and this little smiley. What's her name in the background?
Isabel, yes. This is my
Yes.
self-care. Welcome to my self-care.
I love it though. I love it. I love it. Well, while we wait for Sam to maybe post their question, I just want to thank you again for coming on here today and just having this conversation, just to talk about, kind of just the things. I think one of the things I always talk about, like with the Art Hub and the kind of community that I foster, is what we don't have, someone else does, and what someone doesn't have, we do. And I feel like even when it comes down to like information and first person experiences and support, if we don't have it, like someone else does. And so what I want to do here is at least try to give a platform for what I don't have so that others can still continue to learn and stuff. So I really, really appreciate you. Um, okay, real quick. She put her question. She said, "I just want to ask if it's okay to feel different even though we are not different and we only feel that way because of people around us, and how or what is the best way to avoid this toxicity?"
I think that that is a totally normal feeling. I think that a lot of people feel that way, that they don't exactly fit into society, and especially the society that we lived in. We kind of touched on earlier that is just full of unwellness. And I don't mean that in a mental health sense, I just mean that in like a capitalistic, oppressive,
Yep.
constant drama sort of way. And it's really hard to feel like you're normal. TM, because normal to me in my mind is subjective. What your normal is not my normal, and vice versa. But what you see on TV, like these normal looking families, or what you're perceiving of your friends on Instagram, is not how people live their everyday lives. And I think that a lot of people probably feel similar in that they don't exactly fit in with society, or what the image of society is. Society is changing, right? Because we have all of these different policies that are being made, different players stepping up in different arenas, whether it be health or politics or whatever else. Society is a constantly evolving thing. And I think you may not fit into what society is now, but the future is still there. I like to give myself hope and think about that a lot, because I personally don't fit in with how society is right now. I don't particularly like the way we treat people that are mentally ill, the way we treat people that are homeless, all sorts of stuff. But as more people are pioneering in the field and getting out there and doing that work, hopefully in the future, I will fit in with a brighter society.
I agree. I thanks. That was a really good response, and I think that that's pretty a pretty good like accurate summary, I guess. Because it's like really all we can do is like do our best for ourselves. And so I guess when I say those things, I always want to come back and be like, so good job and thank you for like getting on Twitch and going into like a mental health stream, because if there's anything, at least getting positive support to add to the toxicity that you're dealing with could make a difference. So just thank you a lot for, hanging out with us today in this conversation and stuff.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate it. If you want to take this time now, if you have anything to promote, like where we can find you, I know you've got all of the different changes and stuff, so you probably haven't been streaming as much lately. But if you want to share where people can find you, if you want.
So you can find me here on Twitch. My channel name is Miss Random. And you can also find me on Twitter at Whoa She Random and Instagram as well. All of the links are available on the panels on my channel. So, go and follow me if you'd like to. I usually, because video games is my form of self care, I usually play video games to kind of wind down, but we do have conversations like once a week about like mental health topics and stuff. I like checking in with people, seeing how people are doing. And my community is really supportive. So, good peeps. But
Thank
yes,
you.
thank you so much for having me. And I really hope that people were able to glean at least one thing from my conversation today. And I'm really excited and happy that so many of you on the open notes policy really resonated with you. That's something that I love sharing about and I feel very passionate about. So get out there and take control of your mental health. Woo!